Hello, welcome to Lessons of Vietnam. This is where we try to dispel the myths and misconceptions of the people who fought in the Vietnam War, the men and women who fought. My name is Bill Dixon. I'm your host tonight. I was in Vietnam in 1967, 68, 2009, 2012, and 2014. We're being broadcast tonight from the beautiful headquarters studios of Nissan Communications. You can, of course, you're tuning in tonight. You know about the live broadcast, but just remember that you can go back on demand and see any show we've done in the past. If there's something that you want to pick back up on, so you can contact me at dixonbill80@yahoo.com. And as you already know, there, the live show is ncvi.org. Click. And very important that with the 22 veterans who commit suicide a day, we have the information here about the crisis line and so forth. I hope that if you had anyone or your family that was involved in either of our hurricanes we just had, that everybody's okay and going to be okay. You can see where the people of this country come together quite a bit to help those who are in have needs and so forth. Got a couple of real quick announcements. We got a full show tonight, but tomorrow night, September 14th, if you're in the Raleigh Triangle area, the North Carolina Museum of History at 7 p.m. There will be a screening and panel discussions on the history of the war and what led us into the conflict. That is the part of Ken Burns' special, the 10-part, 16-hour series, which will actually start this coming weekend. Let's see, it will start September 17th through the 21st, and then from 24th to the 28th, from 8 to 10 nightly on UNC Station Channel 4 here, or depending on what you're covering on, what kind of channels you have. And then September 29th at the UNC TV, they will be having a panel discussion on what was learned about from the Vietnam and healing and counseling process. Tonight's show is 60 facts and crazy things of the American Vietnam War. There's probably 600,000 or 60,000 different crazy things that happened during the Vietnam War, but I couldn't get all those in the show. But tonight I want to give you 60 of them. Right now, with the series coming out with Ken Burns and the 50th commemoration, it's hard to realize that I'm getting that old when they start talking about the 50th commemoration of the Vietnam War. We are at the 50th year mark for the start of the war. Soon, more and more government documents from the period will be declassified. A lot of the misconceptions and misfacts are out now because there was nothing out there to have the real truth. Hopefully with some of the declassified material gets involved and some of the scholars get out there and start reading it and going through it, and they'll give the true report of what they find. We'll learn a great deal about this time. Right now, however, the misinformation and cover-ups and confusion about Vietnam still pervade on national consciousness. There's a lot of talk right now with the TV series coming up, which is always good. I think it's going to bring out a lot of information. What my concern is that we don't rewrite the history that is there. Vietnam is a very difficult time to interview a Vietnam vet and really get the story. You see, the only two things that I know of the Vietnam vets can agree on. That was the heat and humidity is one, and then the smells were other of Vietnam. Because it depended on what branch of service you were in, what year you were in Vietnam, where you were located in Vietnam, and what your job was. Everybody's story is different. So it's very hard to get a consensus of what really happened in Vietnam from the soldier's point of view. Because most of us only saw what was in front of us. We never saw the big picture. Most of us didn't get involved with the politics and so forth. So it's been very hard for the soldiers, men and women who fought in Vietnam or served in Vietnam to come back and give a consensus because their story is different. And we've tried to cover that when this shows and continue trying to cover that. Right now, we're going to try to answer some of those questions. The war was conducted during the period of the most significant social upheaval in American history, even more so than the Civil War. Of course, we seem to be refighting the Civil War now, but all the stuff that was going on. The problem with the Vietnam War, it was so politicized. Of course, I can't, all wars are politicized. Okay, our next one. Let's talk about the Vietnam and the Vietnam War. There's been a lot of wars in Vietnam. Vietnam has fought more wars than I think just about anybody else. Going back all the way back into the Ming Dynasty in 1407, it was controlled by Vietnam for 2 decades by the Ming Dynasty of China. And Vietnam's longest reigning dynasty, the next rule from 1428 to 1788. Between 1788 and 1802, peasant revolts, small local kingdoms, and chaos prevailed in Vietnam. The Nguyen dynasty took control in 1802 and ruled until 1945. Now, I would say probably 50% of everybody in Vietnam is named Nguyen in some way or another. First in their own right, then as puppets of the French. When the French came in and decided they would make Vietnam one of their colonizations, they let the Nguyen dynasty also rule for a while. And then the Japanese came in during World War II and took over. When they first came in, they let the Nguyen dynasty continue running it. Well, actually, when they came in, they let the French continue running it. One of the reasons was that the French had joined forces at that time with the Hitler regime, fighting against us. It was only a brief time, but they had. So the Japanese came in and said, okay, you're allies, so we can let y'all come in. But then they come back in on the Second World War. France demanded the return of its colonies in French Indochina. So Japan came back for a second time and during that period of time and run the French out and ran it themselves. The Vietnamese wanted independence, so this touched off the first Indochina War in 1946 and 1954. That is the war that we fought, or the French fought, there trying to get what they felt was theirs after the end of World War II. They felt that Vietnam belonged to them and they had every right to it. And unfortunately, the NATO countries decided on that and turned it back over to the French. Now, it's kind of funny, when they surrendered and the Japanese left, the French came in and took over South Vietnam. The Chinese were giving the power of North Vietnam, but the Japanese turned over the powers to the Vietnamese, which is a lot of the reason that Ho Chi Minh came into power at that time. But when we came back in 1954, after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, that's when the French lost a big battle and they pulled out. It was divided in North and South with the promise of democratic elections. Now, they were said, okay, we're going to divide the countries, but we're going to come back and then join the countries up a little bit later after we have some elections. But the United States and South Vietnam kept postponing those elections and kept putting those elections off because this guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, was so empowered with North and South Vietnam. He was just a special figure to them because of the work he had done fighting the Japanese and so forth, that they didn't want him. They were afraid that the communists would come into power, so they kept putting it off. Well, the North Vietnamese under communist leader Ho Chi Minh invaded the U.S. and supported South Vietnam later in 1954. They got tired of waiting for elections. Of course, they didn't care whether the elections or not. That marking the beginning of the Second Indochina War, also called the American Vietnam War, 1954 to 1975. So if you can see that there, we basically were in Vietnam 21 years fighting the war one way or the other. Actually, we almost go back to 1950. Now, you sit out there and you will look and go, wait a minute here. How is Vietnam spelled? I've seen it spelled one word and I've seen it spelled two words. I tell you, when I got orders for Vietnam, I didn't know where it was. I looked at my mother's old atlas, and in this place they looked like it was supposed to be Vietnam was called French Indochina. So I was totally confused. But the reason it was two different spellings is this symbolized the importance of uniting the two main geographic areas and cultural areas of Vietnam. The mountains representing the north and lowlands representing the south and forming one united country, in fact. Spelling Vietnam using two words has long tradition and is in keeping with the country's pre-colonization history. So when the French took over, they made Vietnam one word, where the original Vietnamese had it two words. But either way, it's spelled Vietnam whether you use it one word or two words. Now, everybody talks about the Vietnam War. Officially, there was no such war as the Vietnam War. Of course, it would be hard to tell us who were there getting shot at and so forth and wounded, and men and women we lost, that it wasn't a war. But Congress never formally declared war against Vietnam. That made it technically the Vietnam conflict, which kind of goes along with the Korean conflict, or the Iraqi conflict, or the Afghanistan conflict. Now, this says the Vietnam War began on 1 November 1955 and ended with the fall of Saigon 30th April 1975, lasting 19 and a half years. Well, we just talked about it. We kind of got started before because we actually furnished a lot of the materials and money that the French used to fight the Viet Minh before Dien Bien Phu. From the end of the 19th century until the 1940s, Vietnam had been a French colony and formed part of French Indochina, as I mentioned a while ago. Most of the conflict took place in Vietnam, but later the fighting spilled over into neighboring Laos and Cambodia in the early 1970s. Officially, well, let's put it this, purported Laos and Cambodia were neutral countries, and there wasn't supposed to be any fighting there. But the communists of the North had no problem running the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia. But the Americans could chase the communists up to the borders and couldn't supposedly go over the borders. So in the 70s, Nixon started the bombing Laos and also sent American soldiers into Laos. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, number 7. As you can see there, that's the Gulf of Tonkin. And you can see the South Vietnam and the South China Sea. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is a purported catalyst for the escalation of American action in Vietnam. It refers to two incidents in August 1964. On August 2nd, the destroyer USS Maddox was shelled by NVA, North Vietnamese Army torpedo boats. Now, one of the reasons there, because they were right up into the Gulf of Tonkin, right about then, I think, and they were supporting some South Vietnamese Navy there. The Maddox responded by firing, over 280 rounds in return. Nobody in the Johnson administration said anything about it whatsoever. However, on August 4th, the second incident was said to have happened. I guess it took them a while to get their mess together. Secretary McNamara admitted in Earl Morris's 2003 documentary, The Fog of War, the second attack never occurred. General Stockdale, Navy pilot, who later shortly after this incident, became a prisoner of war, was actually flying over the Gulf of Tonkin going, what are they shooting at? Because the Maddox was reporting being shot at, and they were shooting back at nothing because there was nothing there. Some people said it was a flock of geese that showed up on the radar, but whatever reason it was, that never happened. The Pentagon Papers even implied the Maddox fired first in an effort to keep the colonists a certain distance away. The resulting Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed by the United States Congress allowed Johnson to deploy conventional ground U.S. troops and operate in a state of open but undeclared war against North Vietnam. Now, up until that time, we had thousands of advisors there and other support people there, but now we're going to actually send combat troops in. Okay. During the early 1960s, there was a secret war where the CIA recruited 50% of the Hmong population to fight for the United States in Vietnam War. The CIA was there for long before as you can see there, long before combat troops were sent in. The CIA was originally comprised of the Special Forces. Robert Kennedy took the Special Forces group away from the CIA and put it into the Army early in his time. The Hmong was an ethnic group that was recorded to. We got to fight for us. The only problem was that after everything was over with, we completely abandoned them. We just walked off and left them too. A few of them came to the United States, but most of them were left to die, which it seems to be during the Vietnam War something that the United States did often. In 1967, protesters in the USA requested a permit to levitate the Pentagon 300 feet in the air through songs and chants to exercise it of its evil and end the Vietnam War. And the authorities agreed to only 3 feet. But I don't think it ever got to 3 feet. But there were some crazy times back in the early 60s and so forth, but with the war protesters and everything else going on. Number 10, between 1962 and 1971, the U.S. sprayed a herbicide agent that was known by the color stripe on the barrel that contained it, such as Agent Orange, over large areas of forest in an attempt to reduce hit and run attacks by the pro-communist forces. It caused 400,000 people to be killed or injured and 500,000 children to be born with birth defects. And we're still having problems today with soldiers in the United States. We're still having problems with soldiers' families being born with birth defects here as well as Vietnam. But Admiral Zumwalt, who was in charge of the Navy at that time, basically ordered it because the problem was, as the Brown Water Navy was going up and down the narrow rivers and so forth, they were getting shot up so bad from the concrete bunkers that were hidden in the foliage along the rivers that he ordered the spraying of Agent Orange to counter that problems. And as a result, his son, who was also a PBR captain, lost his life as a result of cancer from the Agent Orange. Chemical defilants were sprayed all over Vietnam, mostly known as Agent Orange. It was Agent Blue, as I said, and so forth. There were, in fact, several chemicals and formulas used. The stripe on the barrel that contained the chemical gave it its name. In other words, if you got a 55-gallon barrel and it had an orange stripe on it, it was Agent Orange. If it had a blue stripe on it, it was Agent Blue. The long-term effects are still being discovered, and we're still having people here as well as in Vietnam who are dying from it. American casualties. The U.S. military suffered more than 47,000 personnel killed in action during the Vietnam War. 11,000 non-combatant deaths. Now, that could be heart attack, it could be all number of things, a wreck or whatever. More than 150,000 were wounded. And thanks to the helicopter, so many of those lived who would not have lived in World War II in Korea, because the helicopter was used to get most people within an hour to a top-rate hospital or service. There's a myth, one of the many myths, that the average age of the U.S. soldier killed in Vietnam was 19 years of age. But the true figure is actually 22. Still young, but not that teenager. 11,465 of the personnel who were killed were under the age of 20. That's still a lot of young people, no matter how you throw it and look at it. We have a technical difficulty. We'll be back in just a second. Okay, one of the many myths, and a lot of the myths that came out were a result of war protesters coming out. And the reason we fought in Vietnam was so they would have an opportunity, people would have an opportunity to protest. The only problem was difference between then and now was the war protesters protested the soldier instead of the war. Today, we realize that the soldier is sent there and he is not to be considered to be the symbol of the war. So people appreciate the soldiers today for a certain amount. One more back. Okay. Now, okay, let's go back. All right, we're back now. Sorry for that difficulty. Somebody stumped their toe with a wire or something. I don't know. But anyway, you know how it is with the internet. 13, apart from the United States, many other countries suffered casualties in the war. South Vietnam had 300,000 soldiers killed and as many as 3 million civilians. Now, it's important that you remember those numbers because we're going to talk a little bit more later about those numbers. Well, we can talk about them now. There was 300,000 soldiers killed and 3 million civilians killed. And war protesters and also made such a big thing about it, and it is big. That's a lot of people to get killed, especially in civilians. But the truth be known that after the communists took over at the fall of Saigon in 1975, they killed more of their own people than were killed by the 19 and a half years of war we talked about started before. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists or guerrillas, suffered 1,100,000 soldiers killed and 2 million civilian deaths. More than 200,000 Cambodian civilians died, and Laos experienced 30,000 dead. For two countries that weren't involved in a war, that's a lot of people there too. Okay, South Korea was one of our allies. They lost 5,099 people. Now, those guys were tough, the ROKs. Thailand, who also furnished people, lost 1,351. Australia had 521 dead. New Zealand, who was also one of our allies, lost 37. As you see there in red, the Soviet Union lost 16 people. China suffered 1,446 dead, because officially they weren't there. The first known casualty of the Vietnam War, who's listed on the wall, was Richard B. Fitzgibbon of North Weymouth, Massachusetts. He's listed by the U.S. Department of Defense as being killed on June 8, 1956. His name is listed on the wall along with that of his son, Marine Lance Corporal Richard B. Fitzgibbon III, who was killed on September 7, 1965. And 15, as you've probably heard from been on the show before, there are 8 women on the wall. Now, let's talk about some similarities here. Number 16, U.S. and South Vietnamese presidents were shot in 1963, and this is significant. Most of Vietnam was Buddhist, but the government that the United States set up at the end of World War II was basically Catholic. We elected our first Catholic president. Now, it says here that's where the similarities end. We're going to let it go at that. You can come up with your own conclusions. This may also be the death of coherent containing strategy in the country. Diem was shot in an armored personnel carrier on November 2nd, 1963. At that time, there were 16,000 U.S. advisors in Vietnam. President Kennedy was said to be shocked at the news. However, then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamaras said he had never seen the president more upset. Both men knew the U.S. government was responsible to some degree. They were complicit in the coup that overthrew Diem. They didn't go out and shoot President Diem, but let's just say that they were allowed it to happen. Now, some of this information came out from the Pentagon Papers, And they leaked the explicit stated that the U.S. clandestinely maintained contact with them overthrowers, and the United States government gave the generals in Vietnam the green light to start planning a coup. In other words, these generals didn't get together one day at lunch and go, let's have a coup. They talked to a lot of American officials before then. 20 days later, Kennedy himself would be shot in the back of a vehicle. And we still haven't resolved who shot Kennedy and why he was shot and so forth. We're still out there trying to figure all that out. Now, what are these Pentagon Papers we talked about? The Pentagon Papers were titled United States-Vietnam Relations from 1944 to 1967. A study prepared by the Defense Department is a U.S. historical and politically and military involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The papers were released by Daniel Ellsberg. They had worked on the study. They were first brought to the attention of the public on the front page of New York Times in 1971, which caused a lot of flack. A 1996 article in the New York Times said that the Pentagon Papers had demonstrated, among other things, that the Johnson administration systematically lied, and not only to the public, but also to the Congress, which adds a lot to the misinformation and the confusion and so forth of the Vietnam War. Kennedy wanted to get the U.S. military out of Vietnam, but couldn't figure out how. So we go back to FDR, and then Truman, and then Eisenhower. None of them wanted to be the country that lost to communism. That's why we got in Vietnam to start with. Nobody wanted to say you were the president that added to the domino theory and communism spread. So here's Kennedy coming in, and he has to try to figure out to get out. President Kennedy was a fervent believer in the policy of containment and believed in the domino theory, but not so much as to wage unending war with the communists in Vietnam. During his presidency, he and McNamara actively pursued a way to leave Vietnam, while still maintaining their commitment to a free South through financial support and training. Kennedy wanted all U.S. personnel out by the end of 1965. Now, I have no idea. I'm just throwing this out. Did it have something to do with his assassination? We don't know. A lot of strange things going on back during that period of time. The United States didn't lose the war on the ground or only fight untrained farmers. I had a young high school kid ask me one time, well, why didn't y'all win? All you fought was these guerrillas, these farmers who were farmers during the day who put down their hoes and come out back at night with guns. No, we didn't just fight those farmers. We didn't win every battle either, as people like to say. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, can't be faulted for a lack of dedication, patriotism, or leadership. NVA General Vo Nguyen Giap orchestrated successful defeats of the Japanese and French. Even death had a hard time finishing off Giap. He lived to 102. It also can't be faulted for lack of organization. The NVA was a professional fighting force organized under Soviet guidance. The Soviet Union started training Ho Chi Minh long before the war started, just like the Americans trained Ho Chi Minh during the Japanese involvement. But the VC, the Vietnamese Communist guerrilla fighters, were forced to use inferior equipment because the Chinese would swipe the good weapons and replace them with cheap Chinese knockoffs. There were two AK-47s, one the Russians made and the one the Chinese made. The one that the Chinese made were basically a piece of junk. So everybody wanted to get the ones the Russians made. Outmanned and outgunned, the NVA was beaten by U.S. troops in nearly every major battle. The myth of the United States never losing a single battle explicitly persists. That is, unless you were stationed at Fire Support Base Ripcord, outnumbered 10-1 for 23 days in 1970. Not as improbable, no U.S. unit ever surrendered in Vietnam, as in other wars. Fire Support Ripcord. President Richard Nixon began withdrawing soldiers from Vietnam on the radar beginning in 1969, before we actually really started to officially bringing them out. So we were a little short on where we're going to send people. As a main full-strength division, the 101st Airborne was tasked in 1970 with regaining initiatives of the A Shaw Valley. A Shaw Valley, if you saw the movie, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, with Mel Gibson played Hal Moore. It was fought in the A Shaw Valley. It was a key strategic focal point for the NVA. So it was that members of the 187th and 506th Infantry Regiments, along with supporting units under the command of 3rd Brigade, were sent to abandon fire support base Ripcord to set the stage of Operation Texas Star. Beginning in March of 1970, NVA troops in the A Shaw Valley mounted attacks against the outnumbered troops on fire support base Ripcord, using mortar attacks, anti-aircraft guns, and small arms fire. The heaviest of these attacks took place between July 1st and 23rd. During that time, 75 U.S. soldiers were killed in action, making the Battle of Fire Support Base Ripcord one of the deadliest battles in the Vietnam War for the United States. So we lost that one, but we never surrendered. We stayed there and kept fighting. Despite initial victories, the infamous Tet Offensive was a major defeat for the communists. It resulted in the deaths. Now let me go back and explain that. Despite initial victories, what I mean by that was that yes, they went in. We had a Tet is a special holiday in Vietnam. There was a truce that the communists asked for, so people had stood down and were celebrating the Tet Offensive. The Tet holiday, and they started out their attack. And they took over Saigon for a little bit. Some of the places in Saigon, they took over the city of Hue and a couple other places, but very quickly run out every place but Hue. It resulted in the death of some 45,000 NVA troops and the decimation of Viet Cong elements in South Vietnam. Now, when you lose 45,000 men plus the Viet Cong, it's hard to call that a victory. The Tet Offensive succeeded in only one front, the United States media. Saigon fell on April 30th, 1975, 2 years after the Paris Peace Accords, and after the American military left Vietnam, and the United States Congress refused all support as promised to South Vietnam. When Nixon and Kissinger had peace with honor, which was a joke, when they pulled out the United States troops out of Vietnam in 1973, March 29th, the last combat troops left, they left the communists in part of South Vietnam. They told South Vietnam that we would continue supporting them. But the United States Congress, in its infinite wisdom, cut off all support total. So while the Chinese and the Russians were pouring money, troops, and materials in, South Vietnam was left to fend for itself. Oh, that's good. Let's talk about the infamous M16, the rifle of the United States military, the rifle to end all rifles. In the beginning, and maybe with some soldiers even today, they jammed so much that the U.S. troops preferred the AK-47s. Now, if you saw some of our previous shows, we talked a little bit about the AK-47, but if you haven't, I want to go over it again because I think it's very important. General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam, replaced the M14 rifle, which is actually what I carried when I was in Vietnam in '67, with the new M16 as a standard issue infantry rifle in the middle of 1966. There was no particular fanfare. They just brought them out and issued them. The first generation M16 rifle was an awful mess with a tendency to experience a jam in the middle of a firefight. They were hated so much the Army was questioned by Congress in 1967 for delivering such a terrible rifle system and then failing to properly train to use it. The investigation by Congress found several problems with the lack of cleaning supplies and the powder used in the bullets. Now, what I mean by that was, as everything does, we go by the lowest bidder. They bought the M16. The inventor of the M16 had also invented a low residue powder, for the bullets, and also it had to be clean. The American government did not supply the cleaning facilities for the rifles, and they also used the bullets that they already had, which was high resolution. So the first time you shot for a few times in the humidity of Vietnam, the rifle jammed up, and it was like a muzzle loader because you had to take your cleaning rod and jam it down into your barrel to get the, if you had a cleaning rod, that is, jam it down into the barrel to get the bullet out, and it was a one-shot weapon. To make matters worse, when the M16 first came out, the handles were made by Mattel Toy Company, and it had Mattel stamped on the handles. So the rumor went out was that the M16 was in fact built by the Mattel Toy Company. Now the Mattel Toy Company builds a good toy. And it persisted for a long time. So then they took off the stamp Mattel on the handles. They did away with that. So what do you do if you're out there and your M16 jammed up? You want to pick up the enemy's AK-47? Well, it didn't work that well. Let me see if I can read real quick here some of the signs they had there. Let's see. Do me a favor, Tiger. Do a quick something. Check on your rifle before we counterattack. In other words, check your rifle to make sure it works before you go. Operation preventive maintenance. Hey, Sarge, get the copy to the manual with that rifle? No. See, the problem with the AK-47 and M16, they had a definite different sound. So picking up the communist AK-47 and firing it could possibly get you shot by your own guys. If you're out in the jungle or you're in elephant grass, now elephant grass is like being in a wheat field that's 10 to 12 feet high. You can't see your hand in front of your face. All you hear is the sound of the rifles going off. Now, if you pick up an AK-47 and your guys are kind of mixed up and nobody knows where anybody else is, and they start hearing that AK-47, they very well may shoot back. So you had to be careful if you picked up an AK-47. A lot of men died before the M16 problems were solved. Now, there's a lot of Vietnam vets out there that I've talked to over the period of time, talked about how bad the South Vietnamese soldiers were. Now, it wasn't always their fault. You see, in order to get to be an officer in the South Vietnamese military, you could buy your position. If you want to be a general, you just donated enough money to the president of Vietnam and you could be a general with no training whatsoever. Now, if the South Vietnamese soldiers were going to be paid $3 a person by number, and $1 of that was going to be kept by the general, he didn't want to send his men out to get killed because it would cost him some money. So a lot of times they wouldn't go out and do patrols and so forth. You send them out on patrol, they go out a little ways and sit down and have a cup of coffee and so forth, and really not go out on patrol. And also lack of training and lack of leadership. When the wind went out with American soldiers and there was a first firefight going on, you could turn around and there was nobody there but you. They left you. Now, that was not all of them. You had some crack units, the Rangers, the Marines, and so forth, who could hold up with anybody. But that was a problem initially with the South Vietnamese troops. The ARVN troops get mixed reviews from the Americans who fought with them. Most judge ARVN units on their leadership, which was definitely mixed. You've got a guy that's a leader who's never been taught nothing. He's got a position mostly because buying it, and he has no military. Chances are he's not going out to be a leader anyway. He's going to let somebody else be a leader. In the end, the South Vietnamese fought well, but ran out of fuel, ammunition, and other supplies because of lack of support from the United States Congress in 1975. See, even after we left, they held off the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the Russians, and the Chinese for 2 years. And it's hard to fight a war if you don't have food, ammunition, medical supplies, and you can't fly that helicopter because you ain't got enough parts. In the meantime, the North Vietnamese were well supplied by China and the Soviet Union. Kind of crazy way to fight a war. Now, the North Vietnamese Air Force was actually a pretty worthy adversary. Of course, they very seldom, if ever, went over down into South Vietnam. They stayed up north where it was safe, because as long as they were on the ground up north, we couldn't bomb them. You had to wait for them to get up in the air. The Navy's Top Gun Strike Fighter Tactical School was founded to respond to the loss rate of 1 aircraft for every 1,000 sorties during the Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder was a big bombing campaign, which a lot of people look at as being a waste of bombs. We lost 1 of every 1,000, and we flew 1.8 million sorties flown over Vietnam. That's a lot of planes. At war's end, the top ace in North Vietnam had 9 kills compared to the United States top ace, who had 6. The U.S. could only boast 3 aces. Ace status requires at least 5 air-to-air kills, while the NVA-AF boasted 17. Now, there's not that many fighter planes went north. So yes, they had more aces, but they also had more opportunities with the bombers and so forth. And there's a picture of the communists' top ace, Nguyen Van Cock. Now, 25, another crazy thing. Dan Bullock, who was born on December 21st, 1953 in Goldsboro, North Carolina, at the age of 11, Dan's father moved him from Goldsboro to Brooklyn. There, Dan would dream of becoming a U.S. Marine, a pilot, or a police officer. Dan will fulfill one of these dreams. PFC Dan Bullock, United States Marine Corps, is the youngest United States serviceman killed in Vietnam. At the time of his death, Dan Bullock was only 15 years old. Dan was killed on June 7, 1969, at An Hoa Combat Base in Quang Nam Province, South Vietnam. Dan, a rifleman, assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines Foxtrot Company. At the time of his death, Dan, having realized that an attack by the North Vietnamese was much stronger than usual and that the ammunition supply was becoming depleted. He rushed to get more ammunition, support his fellow Marines, not once but twice, and it was upon his return the second time to rejoin his fellow Marines that he was hit numerous times and was killed instantly, basically 3 weeks after he got to Vietnam. Now, they had, from what I have read, they had some idea that he was too young to be there, but he was killed before anybody had anything to do with it. Now let's talk about this man. This man was awesome. His nickname was White Feather. Number 26, Vietnam War #1 sniper, United States Marine Corps Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, White Feather. Marine sniper with 93 confirmed and 360 unconfirmed kills, including a 2,500-meter kill with a Browning machine gun, which he added a scope to. Now, they today, with the rifles we have today and the scopes and so forth, there have been people, snipers, who have done much farther distance, but this man's story is unbelievable. Let's talk about his story here. Carlos Hathcock volunteered to crawl for 3 days across 200 meters of open field with an enemy headquarters, then taking a single shot that killed a North Vietnamese general and had to crawl back out without being spotted. The communist patrols were extensive in trying to find him. That's 3 days he crawled in. Took him 3 days to crawl across this open field to get where he could take the shot. It took him 3 days crawling across this open field to get back. Carlos had bed sores from staying motionless for so long. He could only move when the wind blew the grass around him. Enemy patrols came so close they actually stepped on his hand and stopped the smoke within feet of him. It took him another 3 days to crawl out to safety. I can't imagine laying out there and they're knowing they're looking for you, step on your hand, and you spend 6 days. You don't do much eating, and you definitely don't go to the outhouse out there. Even if you go in your pants, patrols that close, man, to be able to smell you. The man just was phenomenal. The draft, contrary to a lot of opinion, didn't unfairly target the working class or minorities. The demographics of troops deployed to Vietnam were closer to a reflection of the demographics of the United States at the time. 88.4% of troops deployed to Vietnam were Caucasian, 10.6% were African American, and 1% were other races. The 1970 census estimated the African American population of the U.S. at 11%. So the African Americans were not cannon fodder as the war protesters like to do. 70% of those who served who did come from the working class background, but this was a time when most troops had at least a high school education. I've heard it say that we were the dumbest. Well, here it proves that we were the smartest or the best. Members of the wealthy families could, of course, enroll in college for the draft deferment. If you could stay in college and keep your grades up, or had someone else take your test for you, or have a tutor and so forth, you could stay in college. A majority of the men who fought in Vietnam were not drafted; they volunteered, which is another misconception. More than 3/4 of the men who fought in Vietnam volunteered to join the military. Of the roughly 8.7 million troops who served in the military between 1965 and 1973, only 1.8 million were drafted. 2.7 million of the 8.7 million of those fought in Vietnam. So that's right at 6 million men and women who served during that period of time in the military who did not go to Vietnam. Only 25% of the 2.7 million were drafted, and only 30% of the combat deaths in the war were draftees. In contrast, during World War II, where we all heard about everybody after Pearl Harbor dropped everything and went to join the military, 2/3 of the men were drafted in World War II. Kind of goes counter to what some of our history has been teaching us. Vietnam veterans are not mostly crazy. That's questionable sometimes. Homeless, drug users, it was said by many upon their return home, by the war protesters and other people who didn't know the difference. There is no difference in drug uses between Vietnam veterans and non-Vietnam veterans of the same age group. 97% of Vietnam vets hold honorable discharges. A large portion of those who did not receive honorable discharge were part of McNamaras special program, and 85% of Vietnam veterans made successful transition to civilian life. Unemployment rate for Vietnam vets was only 4.8% in 1987 compared to 6.2% rate for the rest of America. The Medal of Honor was awarded to 240 men during the Vietnam conflict. There have been other medals of honor since then. 61% of those who died in Vietnam were younger than 21 years old, and 11,465 were under the age of 20. 5 young men killed in Vietnam were just 16 years old, and the oldest man known to have been killed was 62 years old. Career soldier, I'm certain. A total of 997 soldiers reported to have died on their first day in Vietnam, with 1,448 soldiers dying on their last day. If I got to die in Vietnam, do it on my first day. Don't let me go through all this junk for 364 days and wake up and then get me killed. The most casual deaths for a single day was on January 31st, 1968, with 245 deaths that day, which happens to also coincide with the first day of Tet, 68. The most casual deaths for a single month was May 1968, with 2,415 casualties, which occurred results from the communist attacks during the Tet holidays of 1968. 31 sets of parents lost 2 sons in the conflict. 1,675 Americans found Vietnam remains were still unaccounted for. Of 39 of those from North Carolina. Number 36, during the Vietnam conflict, the average infantryman would experience an average of 240 days of combat per year, while during World War II, an infantryman only experienced an estimated 40 days of combat over a 4-year period. The reason being, in World War II, they would take you out to the front, you would fight, then they'd bring you back for replacements and new training because of the wonderful thing called helicopter. The average Vietnam soldier saw 240 days. They would fly the replacements out to them. They would take and pick them up and then take them to a new place and fight the next day. Overall income of Vietnam vets is 18% higher than the non-veterans in the same age group. Only 0.5% of the Vietnam veterans have been jailed for crimes. Now let's talk about, a while ago I mentioned something about a special group who got bad conduct discharges and so forth. The book written about them, McNamaras Folly, use of low IQ troops in the Vietnam War. There was one group of men who had been beyond the reach of the draft. They needed more men. What we're going to do away with the college deferments? No. Those who had been disqualified because they failed the military's mental test, despite warm bodies, desperate for warm bodies, Johnson and McNamara decided to induct the low-scored men who Johnson referred to in his secret White House tape as second-class fellows. Military leaders from William Westmoreland, the commanding general in Vietnam, to lieutenants and sergeants at the platoon level, viewed McNamara's program as a disaster. Some of these guys couldn't button their shoes, tie their shoes, button their shirts, or make their bed in a military manner. Because many of the Project 100,000 men were slow learners, they had difficulty absorbing necessary training. And when you're in combat, you want a guy well trained. Because many of them were incompetent in combat, they endangered not only themselves, but their comrades as well. Going back to really talk, I'm running out of time, but it's important that we talk about them. Those guys quite often got bad conduct discharges, and the bad thing about it was, because they got bad conduct discharges, or bad paper as we call it, they were not eligible for a lot of the benefits that there was for the Vietnam vets, which is now being looked at, but they were treated by their own troops as quite a bit different. Number 39, the conflict took place during the Cold War. Now, what exactly is the Cold War? The global struggle for supremacy between superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union and China. In other words, if you want to have a war between these superpowers, don't have the war in the United States, don't have the war in the Soviet Union, don't have the war in China. Let's find another country and fight the war there. That way we can supply the weapons, we can send the troops in, we can kind of invent new weapons and so forth. The Cold War was a state of geopolitical tension after World War II between powers in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and powers in the Western Bloc, the United States and its NATO allies. Historians do not fully agree on the dates, but a common time frame has appeared between 1947 and 1991, which was the year the Soviet Union collapsed. It was essentially a war between communist and anti-communist forces. The United States was concerned that if the whole of Vietnam became communist, it would spread to other countries in the region. The idea was known as the domino effect, which we've already talked about. And the war was, the United States was about to prevent from this happening. In other words, the United States just was not going to let everybody turn to communist. The communist North Vietnam forces were supported by the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, the People's Republic of China, and the Soviet Union. The first flag is the communist North Vietnam. The middle flag is Russia, and the other flag is China. The American the anti-communist forces consist of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, the United States, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and Laos. And there was a lot of men who came down from Canada who joined the United States military while the Americans were running up to Canada to hide. Now let's talk about, probably can get through this thing about Ho Chi Minh here. 40, the recognized leader of the North Vietnamese was called Ho Chi Minh. Now he changed his name quite a few times over the years. He led the independence movement from 1941 onwards and established a communist rule in 1945. During that period of time between the French coming in and taking over and so forth, he took over in North Vietnam. He officially stepped down from power in 1965. He remained a figurehead throughout the war. He also served as president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam from 1945 until his death in 1969. Ho's opposition to colonialism, which were the French and Japanese and Chinese, began at the age of 9 when he worked as a messenger for an anti-colonial organization. His father also introduced him to several revolutionaries. Ho went on to attend the National Academy in Hue, Vietnam, Dismissed from the academy after taking part in protests against the French in 1908. He traveled to southern Vietnam in 1909 and worked briefly as a school teacher. During World War II, during World War I, 1914 to 1918, Ho worked in London, England, Paris, France. During this time, Ho's lifelong commitment to communism and Vietnamese independence began, where he got his education. In Paris, Ho adopted the name of Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot, and attracted attention when he presented a written request to the Versailles Peace Conference demanding independence for Vietnam. When the United States and all the allies and everybody were deciding on how to divide up these countries that were during World War II, that he wanted independence. Ho became a founding member of the French Communist Party in 1920. From 1920 to 1923, he was outspoken leader of the Vietnamese community in Paris, participated in the Intercolonial Union formed under communist sponsorship and publishing 2 anti-colonial journals. Man was busy. Ho was invited to Moscow, Russia in 1923, where he studied at the University of Oriental Workers. In 1925, he was sent to China to organize a communist movement. That time, China wasn't communist. He formed the Thai Nine Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League, whose members were mostly Vietnamese students in the southern Chinese port city of Canton. The league called for independence, redistribution of land, fair taxation, equal rights for men and women. Equal rights for men and women, Communist Party. Okay, propaganda is wonderful. In 1927, Ho was forced to leave Canton after the Chinese government cracked down on local communists. Ho returned to South China in 1930 to unite the factions as a formal communist party, drawing its members from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. He continued his organization in Hong Kong and Shanghai, but was arrested by the British in 1931 and imprisoned for 2 years. Released in 1933, he spent the next several years in the Soviet Union. In 1940, Ho returned to South China. With most of Vietnam under Japanese occupation, he chaired a meeting of the party's Central Committee inside the Vietnamese border, making his first return to Vietnam in 30 years. This was the time that the United States came in and trained General Gipp and Ho Chi Minh how to fight, gave them weapons and so forth, because the idea was they were supposed to run out the Japanese. Ho, after the Japanese were run out, Ho then announced the formation of the Viet Minh League for Vietnamese Independence, an organization demanding independence from French rule and Japanese military occupations. From 1941 to 1945, although imprisoned again in China for more than a year, Ho led in seeking support for the Viet Minh, which was his communist group, forming an alliance with American diplomats and intelligence officers in South China. Let me read that again. Forming an alliance with American diplomats and intelligence officers in South China, because he helped us out. When he died, beginning in mid-1960, Ho Chi Minh's health declined, and he made only occasional public appearances. There's more reasons for that. He never married, but he was widely viewed in North Vietnam as the father of his country and often referred to in later years as Bác, Uncle Ho. He died of heart attack on September 3rd, 1969, almost 6 years before the South Vietnamese government surrendered. He never saw the end of the war and the communist takeover. Now, this is that was the mausoleum that he had. It looks like you can ride. It's sitting way back off the road. You can hardly see it from the main highway and so forth. But and he doesn't have the statue he used to have. Now, we started on this at 9 o'clock, and I'm going to cut it off, and we're going to finish it up the next show or the show after that. But I want to throw something out for you to think about. Who really called the shots at Hanoi? See, everybody thought it was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was just kind of the figurehead. The next time we're going to find out who and how made decisions to fight in Vietnam. Who was the people behind all the efforts and so forth of Vietnam. Appreciate you tuning in. We're looking forward to being back on September 27th. I had as a guest my friend Steve Asai, who has quite a story to tell us. I may let Steve come on and do this, and then we'll just come back and the following show do the rest of this. But because there's 60, and I got to 41, I couldn't talk any faster. But again, the things that are coming up. If you're in the Raleigh area, try to get to the History Museum tomorrow night at 7 o'clock for the showing. If you're in the Raleigh Triangle area, Friday it's National POW/MIA Day. The ceremony will be at 6 o'clock instead of 12. Important, the ceremony will be at 6 o'clock instead of 12 because of traffic and so forth. You have a good evening, and hope if you don't have power and so forth, I hope all the problems we have with the 2 hurricanes get solved. Good night.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.